That's right.
And our audience, for that matter.
Yeah, it's
Peter, you've turned your mic off. Oh. Ah. We're ready to go, I think. Good evening. I'm Brent Taylor, the convener of the speaker program for the Military History and Heritage Victoria. On behalf of myself and our hardworking committee, I welcome you to tonight's event, our third Zoom speaker presentation. Tonight we'll try something a little different to make the session feel a bit more like a normal meeting. During the session, you may leave your video on, but bear in mind, people will be able to see you. As usual, the microphones will be switched off. Tonight, we're pleased to have Dr. Peter Monteath presenting Battle on 42nd Street, the War in Crete and the Anzacs' Bloody Last Stand. And as you heard, Peter's in Adelaide. Oh, wrong button. Dr. Monteath is Professor of History at Flinders University in Adelaide, Australia. He was born and grew up in Brisbane before attending the University of Queensland, Sagan University in the Federal Republic of Germany, and Griffith University. He has lectured at 3 Australian universities. He has also been Adjunct Professor at the University of St. Louis, Missouri, and the Technical University of Berlin, where he is an Alexander von Humboldt Fellow. Currently, Peter teaches modern European history and writes about various aspects of European and Australian history, with a particular interest in things German. As usual, Peter will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. I invite you to send me a chat message to me anytime up to and including question time. And you can do that by clicking the chat icon in the middle bottom of the Zoom panel, or at least it is on Windows versions. Send the question to everyone. Everyone will be able to see it. When the time comes, I will read your question beginning with your first name. By now, you should be on speaker view with your microphone off. Leave your video on if you like, but remember that people can see you. I now invite Peter to talk. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Brent, and thank you for the kind introduction. Thanks for inviting me to talk to you. Thanks also to Jason, who's been helping with the technology, and Jason might guide me now, because I suppose I'll go to share screen to begin my presentation to you. And I'm very happy to do this. This book came out about a year ago, and because of the year that we have behind us, I've had limited opportunities to speak about it in public. I did give a presentation to the Naval and Military Club here in Adelaide a couple of months ago, but otherwise my opportunities to talk about the book have been a bit limited. I think when we first had contact, the idea was that I might come over to Melbourne and talk to you there, which would have been great, but for reasons that are obvious to all of us, that sadly wasn't a possibility. So it's great that we have this technology that allows us to communicate across these sorts of distances. So I'm wondering whether I can get some help then in making that appear.
It's appeared for everybody.
The view is different for you.
It's different from me. So can you, are you able to see my screen there?
Yes.
Is that all right?
Yes.
Okay, so what I've got there is the book. This is the book that came out last year, late in the year, published by New South. And it was a book, I thought what I'd do is talk a little bit about how I came to to doing the book, why it is that I came to this topic. And then I'll tell you a little bit about the book, but I always feel a bit ambivalent about these things because, of course, I hope that at the end of it, you might be interested enough to perhaps want to buy the book, to read it. So I won't reveal everything, but hopefully whet your appetite to some extent. I became aware of Crete and the battle for Crete when I did a book a few years ago, which was about Australian POWs in German captivity. And a good number of those POWs were captured as a result of the battle for Crete. There were something like 3,000 of them. So in researching that book, of course, I had to read into the history of Crete and how it was that so many Australians were captured there. And when I did that book, I became aware of the story of one particular Australian, and his name was Johnny Peck. Now, Johnny Peck was a Victorian, born in Sydney, but raised in Victoria. And he became a POW, and indeed, much of the interest of the Johnny Peck story was in his experiences as a POW. The book was called Escape Artist because he was one of these people who kept escaping. But before that part of his story unfolded, he was a member of the 2nd 7th Battalion, a Victorian raised battalion. He fought in North Africa, he went to Greece, he was taken then to Crete, and he took part in this particular battle that took place on the morning of the 27th of May, 1941. And I was very struck when I heard a recording of an interview with Johnny Peck, very struck by the way that he talked about this particular battle, which seemed such an unusual part of what was otherwise a very high-tech war, because this battle is essentially a bayonet battle. And you might think surely in the Second World War there was little scope for the use of the bayonet. So what I was confronted with was this story of a battle where bayonets were used and were used to good effect by the Australians and New Zealanders in particular. So I took this idea to my publisher and said I'm interested in writing not a general book about the battle for Crete, but rather I wanted to focus on this one particular battle. And sure enough, the publisher said, well, that's great. We don't really want a general campaign history because there are some very good books about the battle for Crete, and maybe some of you have come across them. Many of you may well be fans of Anthony Beevor, and quite early in his career, he wrote a book called Crete, the Battle and the Resistance. That's an excellent book. As the title says, it covers not just the battle, but the long and brutal German occupation of Crete. And then there's a particularly good book by someone called I.M.G. Stewart, which is called The Struggle for Crete, A Story of Lost Opportunity, 20th of May to the 1st of June, 1941. And that for me is the best book about the struggle for Crete. And quite telling about it is its subtitle, the subtitle, A Story of Lost Opportunity, because that's a theme that comes up again and again when historians talk about the battle for Crete. Is this a battle that might perhaps have been won? And sure enough, it's a battle that's attracted the attention of lots of historians. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think there's a fascination with it because it was a relatively short and brutal war, lasting as it did just for 12 days. So this wasn't a campaign where there were periods of not much happening. This was a period where there was an awful lot happening in a big hurry. And it was also a very high-tech war, or there's a strange juxtaposition perhaps, that on the one hand it's very high-tech. This is a campaign that features the use of German paratroops who are dropped into Crete. So the Germans are bringing to this campaign the most modern technology that they have. These very well-trained troops, very well equipped, delivered to the battlefield with the very latest technology. And against that, this is the juxtaposition, it was a very vicious war, in some senses even archaic, because sometimes the defenders, and I mean not just the Australians and New Zealanders and British troops, but the locals, the Cretans, they defended the island with everything that they could get their hands on, whether that was blunderbusses from the 19th century or pitchforks or knives. So there's this story of a battle which is both very modern and very ancient. When I approached it, I said to the publisher, I didn't want to tell a general history. I wanted to do something that was a bit distinctive. And my pitch was, I said, look, I think I can focus on this one particular battle, but what I can do is a bit different, because I think I can tell the story of this particular battle from multiple perspectives. So of course I was interested in the Australians. I'd read Johnny Peck's account, I'd written about it, but I thought I can write about the New Zealanders as well. And it does seem to me that while we often talk about Anzacs, in terms of the way we write history, often Australians and New Zealanders write separate military histories. They don't necessarily put the two together. And I wanted to put those two together and to look not just at the Australian sources, but look at what the New Zealanders had left in terms of records of this event. And beyond that, though, as Brent said in the introduction, my background is in German history. So I wanted to look at it from the German perspective as well. And so I wanted to go to the German sources, to the military archive there, and to find out what the Germans had written about their experience of Crete and what it was like from their perspective to confront these Australians and New Zealanders. And I should perhaps mention that among those New Zealanders was a Maori battalion. And so what I had here was the opportunity to look very closely at one small and in the grander scheme of things, not particularly influential battle, but I could do it from multiple points of view. And that seemed quite an exciting prospect for me as I started doing this. And the other thing that I tried to introduce to the book is the question of motivation. So it seemed to me that a lot of history of war is about men being sent overseas to die, which of course is a very major part of what the war experience is about, whether from an Australian or from other perspectives. But of course the other part of this is that men were being sent overseas to kill. That was the function of soldiers. And I was interested in that question, how is it that apparently normal, ordinary young men can be put in that set of circumstances where they are able to follow the logic of war and kill on the battlefield as required. So I wanted to look at this question of motivation and how it applied to these soldiers on both sides of the war and how that was brought to bear in this particular battle. And my way into that particular question was through the bayonet. And I suppose for those of you who have service backgrounds, this image will be very familiar to you. This is the pattern 1907 bayonet with a sheath. One of the distinctive features of this bayonet is that it's quite long. It's 18 inches in the old measurements, and this was the standard bayonet used by not just Australian, but basically by all British and Commonwealth forces in the First World War, and then again in the Second World War. And I start the book with a short chapter which is called The Bayonet, A Short, Sharp History. And it's about the history of the bayonet from its beginnings back in the 1600s. It charts the development of the weapon. There were various iterations of it. You know, in the early days, there was this thing called the plug bayonet, where they would stick the bayonet, the blade, down the muzzle of a firearm, and then over time they worked out ways to attach the bayonet to the outside of the muzzle, and then there were different designs. So there were blades, there were different shapes in cross section. There was a debate by the late 19th century about whether it was good to have a short bayonet or a long bayonet. This was the so-called reach debate, where some people said it's much better to have a short one because it's cumbersome otherwise at close quarters. Others said that there were advantages to be gained from having a long bayonet because you could reach your enemy before your enemy could reach you. And then by the 20th century, the big debate was, had the bayonet become superfluous? By the 20th century, with warfare having changed so radically, was there any point to having bayonets at all? And there were different schools of thought about this, because some people said, look, in the age of artillery and machine guns, there's not much point carrying a bayonet around. And sure enough, if you look at some of the statistics from the First World War, very few men were killed by bayonets. So that the overwhelming majority were killed by artillery and by machine guns. And so there were those who said, well, let's not bother with it. Against that, there were those who said, well, even if you have advanced weapons such as artillery that force the enemy into retreat, you still need infantry to occupy those enemy positions, and those infantrymen still would have some use for the bayonet, even if the effect of the bayonet was primarily to scare the enemy away, to make sure that the enemy didn't engage with them as they occupied this newly won territory. But the big argument, and it remains the main argument to this day, the big argument for keeping bayonets was a psychological one, which related to the men who carried them. And the idea was that through basic army training in the use of the bayonet, soldiers became accustomed to associating the fixing of a bayonet with transporting themselves into a kind of hyper-aggressive state. And this was something that was borne out through their training. Here's one example of an Australian training in the use of the bayonet. And the idea was that as they trained, they prepared themselves for close combat. They associated any command to fix bayonets with a sense that they were entering into a very dangerous predicament in which they would be required themselves to act very aggressively to confront the enemy, and if necessary to use the bayonet, the fixed bayonet, against their enemy. And so the argument was that in terms of the psychological preparation for war, this kind of training was still indispensable, even if in reality, when conflicts happened, it was extremely unlikely that they would be using that weapon for the purpose of killing. It was primarily a weapon for psychological benefits. This is a shot that is on the front cover of the book. And here you can see, as it so happens, the 2nd 7th Battalion. So this is this Victorian battalion. And this is shortly before they were deployed to Greece and Crete. And there we see them in training again, adopting this aggressive attitude, albeit if you look closely enough with the sheaths still on their bayonets. So that's how I set the book up, that it's about a battle in which bayonets feature very prominently. And it's about this question of motivation. How do men become trained to do what they need to do in war, and that is to kill. And then I tell the story leading up to 42nd Street by setting the context. I tell the story not as an overview history, but I single out particular, if you like, characters. So of course I write about Johnny Peck as a significant participant in that battle. It's worth mentioning perhaps because it's NAIDOC week that I spend quite a bit of time devoted to Reg Saunders, and he'll be a name familiar, I'm sure, to many of you, an Indigenous man from Victoria who was also a member of this 2nd 7th Battalion. I write about particular New Zealanders, where they came from, what kind of training they had. I write about some Englishmen who feature then quite prominently in the war in Crete. And then, of course, I want to look at the Germans as well. So I talk about really the brains behind the German invasion of Crete. That was a man by the name of Kurt Student. There's a fabulous book by one of the Parachutists, a man of aristocratic background, as you might notice in his name, Baron August von der Heite, who wrote after the war a wonderful book about his experiences of fighting in Crete. And so I introduce these men. I follow their individual stories until ultimately they meet on the field of battle. And I title one of those chapters Ordinary Men, because the idea here is that really these are quite ordinary, normal men in many ways. But what happens here is that they are prepared for circumstances which are really quite abnormal, and then I'm interested to see how they respond when they're placed in those quite unusual circumstances. Now, I've got here a map of Greece, and perhaps this is the best way to put the battle for Crete into context. So what happened in 1941 was that the Australian forces, the 6th Division, which had been fighting very successfully in North Africa, was transported to Greece. There was an expectation almost that at some point the Germans would invade Greece, and sure enough, that's exactly what happened on the 6th of April. So German forces invaded Greece through both Bulgaria and Yugoslavia at about the same time. And the Australians had been deployed in part up in the very north of Greece, around Vevi. The 2nd 7th, which features so prominently in my story, was sent up even after the invasion had commenced to a place called Domokos. And the experience of the Australians here, as with the New Zealanders who were there, as with the Greek forces, the British forces, was that they were overcome very, very quickly, and they were forced into a rapid retreat to the south. The experience of the war here was that the The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, dominated the air. The German tanks moved at a surprising speed. By this time, of course, the Germans were well practiced in the art of blitzkrieg. And so this campaign, from the German perspective, was extremely successful, and it was rapid, and there were very few occasions where the Germans, where the Australians and the New Zealanders had the opportunity to see the Germans close up. So that by the last week of April, the defensive forces were being evacuated, some of them from around Athens, and then a lot of them from the Peloponnese, a lot of the Australians, the 2nd, 7th, primarily from the little port of Kalamata there. And the map indicates that they were taken to Crete. Not all of them were taken to Crete, some were taken on to Alexandria. But it was becoming clear that Crete too would be invaded. Hitler made that decision on Anzac Day, 1941. And his thinking would have been that if he controlled Crete, then this would be important for his supply lines to Rommel in North Africa, but it would also protect his southern flank because, of course, this is April 1941. It's just 2 months before Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. So that's, for him, that's the main game. But what he doesn't want is some kind of distraction from the south. So he decides on the 25th of April that what he wants to do is to occupy Crete. And for him, the question is how to do that. What can he do to claim Crete quickly and efficiently, given that his main goal at this time is the invasion of the Soviet Union. So if we look at the map of Crete there, we see his dilemma. He's been persuaded that the way to do this is to stage an invasion by the air, and to stage that invasion successfully, what he needs to do is to claim at least one airfield on Crete. And you might see there were 3 airfields, one in the west at a place called Melamé, one at Rethymnon, and then further to the east in Heraklion. So the German plan was to stage an invasion which targeted those 3 airfields, and that required them to take at least one. If they had just one, then what they could do was to fly in then fresh troops, mountain troops, who would then, from that foothold of an airfield, extend their control over the rest of the island. There was a second part to the plan, so that there was a plan which envisaged mountain troops being delivered to Crete through a small flotilla, in fact, a couple of flotillas. But the first and crucial step was to take an airfield. From the Anzac point of view, their task was to defend the airfields. And the advantage they had, or the main advantage they had, was that they were very well informed about German intentions. So they knew that the Germans were going to stage an invasion. They had access to ultra intelligence. They knew pretty much when that would be. They suspected that part of that invasion would be seaborne. And so they disposed their forces so as to protect the beaches as well, where they thought German troops might arrive by sea. But the main focus had to be on the airfields. The map's useful perhaps also because you get a sense of the relative strengths there. There were lots of Commonwealth and other forces disposed to defend the island, more than the Germans realised. The Germans, on the other hand, were extremely well equipped. These were, to a large extent, elite forces. And they, at this stage of the war, were full of confidence that the Blitzkrieg strategy had worked beautifully in other parts of Europe. And so they launched their invasion attempt on the 20th of May, 1941. And for those who observed it, it must have been quite an astounding event, because all of a sudden this morning, all of these parachutes appeared in the sky above the airfields and around the capital, Kanya. And it became clear that at last this invasion was taking place. Some of the troops were delivered by glider as well. That was part of the plan. These were gliders that had been towed from the Greek mainland, 10 men per glider. But what happened was that when these Germans arrived, whether by parachute or by glider, they got a terrible shock, because the defenders were waiting for them, and very large numbers of them were killed. In many cases, they were killed even before they hit the ground. This is an image of these German parachutists. You can see how they were equipped. There's some of them who had light machine guns. They wore these smocks. The helmets they wear are a distinctive shape. Behind them, you see their standard transport aircraft, the Junkers 52. These are men who are waiting on an airfield on the mainland, ready to be transported over to Crete for the invasion. And this is perhaps the most famous of the parachutists. I don't know whether anybody recognises this man. This is Max Schmaling, who was world heavyweight boxing champion. He was one of the paratroops flown in on the morning of the 20th of May and managed to survive the battle. And he is one of the gliders. The idea was that they would crash land. That was the intention. But in many cases, they landed in places that weren't suited for glider landings, which were extremely rocky, or there were tree stumps there. So many of these men were dead by the time their gliders reached a standstill. And this was all part of the great shock for the Germans when they attempted to take an airfield on the first day. So what happened was that the airfield at Heraklion was held. It was defended mainly by British forces. The airfield at Rethymno, that was the one in the middle, that was defended successfully largely by Australian forces, the 2nd 1st and the 2nd 11th battalions. In both those cases, there was a kind of stalemate at the end of the first day. But the crucial one was Maleme, the airfield in the west of the island, defended by New Zealanders. It came under very heavy attack from the morning of the 20th of May. It was bitterly fought over for the duration of that first day. And then most controversially, at the end of that day, in the night from the 20th to the 21st, the New Zealanders retreated from the hill which overlooked the airfield. And by losing that crucial position overlooking the airfield, they opened up the possibility for the Germans at first light the very next morning to land on the airfield, and from that time on to make use of the airfield. So there's a very strong case that with the New Zealand abandonment of that crucial position, the battle for Crete was lost. From that point, it was arguably just a question of time. Now, the New Zealanders, of course, recognised that straight away. The defensive forces were under the command of a New Zealander in Bernard Freyberg. And of course, efforts were made to retake the Maleme airfield. that effort is described in the book, but I've included here for you one of the illustrations I found in the New Zealand archives. This is an illustrated diary by a New Zealander, F.W. Carr, and he describes how the New Zealanders undertook this effort, and of course they're armed with their bayonets, and it's clear here that they were more than willing to use the bayonet in this nighttime effort to retake the Melamé airfield, but ultimately that was unsuccessful. And so from that point onwards, wave after wave of transport aircraft arrived at Melamé. More and more German troops, mountain troops built up, and bit by bit, they fought their way eastward from Melamé to take the rest of the island. Now, there are various battles over the following week. The book describes a particular battle at Galatas, a crucial position, and I described there how bayonets were used in defending Galatas, retaking Galatas, losing Galatas. And then a week into the battle, the Anzacs and others have retreated to a defensive line called 42nd Street. And the reason it's called 42nd Street is because in the previous year, a British engineering unit had bivouacked there for a time, and their title was the 42nd Field Engineers. And so they named this dirt road after themselves and put up this sign. And the street was a sunken road which ran southward roughly from the tip of Suda Bay. And it was a crucial defensive line to which the Australian and New Zealand forces fell back during the night from the 26th to the 27th of May. They reached this line, they were exhausted, they'd been under pressure from the first day of the battle. There were Australian and New Zealand battalions camped along this line. You can see that the Australian battalions, the 2nd 8th and the 2nd 7th, were at the northern end of the line, and then they were next to these New Zealand battalions. It's the 28th Battalion, which was the Maori Battalion. So they were spread out along the line. They didn't realise at first during the night that they were the last line of defence. They thought that perhaps there were still some other forces further to their west, but it became clear that they were the defensive line on this early morning of the 27th of May. And the battalion commanders, New Zealanders, Australians, consulted with each other, and recognising the vulnerability of their situation, they pulled back to the line itself, made sure that they weren't straying any further to the west. And they came to an agreement among themselves that when the Germans arrived, and that seemed just a matter of time, then they would charge, they would fight back. And it seems that many of the men welcomed that opportunity, because for them in Greece and then for the first week in Crete, the story of their war had been a story of falling back, always being overcome by German air power, overcome by German artillery. And what presented itself almost unexpectedly on this morning was the opportunity to engage with the Germans at close quarters. This was an area which had olive trees. It was an area in which it wasn't possible to use artillery from any distance because of the lack of visibility. And so what happens on this morning is that a German battalion of mountain troops makes its way eastward, thinking that at some point it's going to come across the enemy, but it doesn't know exactly where and when. It's a battalion that's only just arrived. They arrived, most of them had arrived the previous day. And it's clear that they didn't really know what to expect. And so what I do in the climax of the book, the two key chapters, is describe what unfolds at this point, collecting as well as I could the accounts from Australians who participated, New Zealanders. I look at what the Germans recorded about what unfolded, and perhaps what I could do to give you a sense of what it was like for those men who were engaged in this quite furious battle is to read you just a couple of excerpts just to give you some of that flavour. So the first excerpt I've got for you is from an Australian called Frank Reiter. He was in the 7th Battalion in C Company. He says, recording what happened on this morning, I took the whole platoon out, and with the orders that if we had contact, then we were to start fighting. And the rest of the battalion they'd come over and help us, because after being bombed all around Greece and that, we were really browned off with the Germans and wanted to close in on them. Well, we got to this food dump because rations had been pretty short. We're thinking of having a feed, and one of the boys spotted Germans the other end doing the same. You know, the Germans must have been hungry and started having a feed at the other end, and we were on the other end. When we struck these Germans there, we forgot about the feed. So it was then on for young and old, because all we were doing that time being bombed, you know, for a month and knocked around, all we wanted to do was get even with them. That was all we were thinking. And from then it was on. And then I mentioned earlier Reg Saunders, also in the 7th Battalion. And he described what happened like this. He wrote later, when Jerry saw us coming and someone gave a yell to give himself more courage, everyone took it up. Before you could say it, we were bolting along, screeching at the top of our voices. It was crazy, crazy. The most thrilling few minutes of my life. We were all obsessed with this mad race to slaughter with the bayonet. It wasn't like killing kangaroos anymore. When we got close, they were real men, excited like us, and some of them terribly frightened. They were highly trained Germans, but they got the shock. They got such a shock at our din and the way we ran that they forgot they were supermen and ran, the whole 400 of them. We used our knees and rifle butts and our blades. For a while, we stopped being ordinary blokes and became bloodlusted creatures. So that was Reg Saunders. And then to give you a New Zealand perspective and really the crucial role among the New Zealanders, interestingly, is played by the Maori battalion, who clearly had been using bayonets in other battles in Crete and would continue to do so in other theatres of war. So this is one of their descriptions of what happened from a man called Humphrey Dyer, one of the Maoris. Matthews, one of his fellow soldiers, was armed with a Tommy gun, which he preferred. Hemi, that's another of the Maoris, had a German sniper's rifle, a prized possession from which he had removed the silencer and affixed the short bayonet. I had a service rifle. We spaced ourselves at 10 to 15 yards. The charge started on our right. We went forward yelling, charge, charge. Matthews, an expert with the Tommy gun, cleared his front. A few Germans stood their ground. Others got up and scuttled away. The battalion on our left stayed bunched behind their olive trees. We yelled, charge, charge, the bastards are running. Hemi rushed a bush from which a Hun kept firing at him and bayoneted the man. He said afterwards, I wish I had shot him, the scream was dreadful. One stayed and had a snap shooting match with me at close quarters in Wild West style. After a few yards, we came to a wide, shallow ditch in which a lot of Germans lay sprawled out. Some were obviously dead, some were wounded. many were doubtful. At Mallarmé, we had suffered casualties by sparing 3 German Tommy gunners. After our passing, they had seized up their guns and fired at our backs. Matthews tried one with a burst and he jumped. After that, everything, dead or alive, was made certain of. So that's just a couple of examples of what it was like for these men to be engaged in this bayonet charge on the morning of the 27th of May, a bayonet charge that it seems led to the deaths of 124 Germans. This is the man who led the Germans into battle, the battalion commander. Quite an interesting story, because it seems that what happens to him is that his nerves were so frayed as a result of this encounter that he didn't play any active role in the war from that point. His name was Hans Forster. And there was a mention in that last quote that I gave you of a wide, shallow ditch. This is possibly it. I'm not sure. When I was doing the work for this, I came across a young historian in Crete who has been collecting artifacts of the Battle of Crete, and included in those artifacts are a number of photographs. And so this is a photograph from 42nd Street. Perhaps this is the very same ditch that is referred to in that New Zealand description, and you can see here the aftermath of the battle. So clearly what's happened here is that the sort of training that the Australians and New Zealanders had done kicked in. Placed in that situation, they behaved exactly as they had been trained to respond. Clearly they used their bayonets. That's not to say that all of them did, but the evidence of the battlefield afterwards was clear enough. And I don't want to suggest that every Australian New Zealander participated in this. There are interesting studies of men at war that claim that in the case of the Second World War, a study done of American troops indicated that 75% never fired at the enemy for the purpose of killing, even though they were engaged in combat and under direct threat. So not every man responds in the same way when placed in this situation, but clearly in this particular instance, on this morning, on this day, at this location, the aim of their training to place men into this hyper-aggressive state, it came into effect with this very result that on a very rare occasion in this battle, the Anzacs turned the tables and forced the Germans to run, to flee from the battlefield. Now, as I think I hinted earlier, it's not as if this is a battle that changes the course of the battle for Crete. By this day, it's clear that the battle for Crete as a whole was lost. This was a day on which the defensive forces were already heading towards the evacuation points. If it has a value, it's a kind of symbolic value, because it showed the Australians and New Zealanders that the Germans could be defeated. It was possible to turn the tables. I mentioned in the book that it just so happens that the 27th of May is also the day on which the Bismarck was sunk. So there too is perhaps a kind of symbolic act which anticipated what was still to come. I should say that in the book then I do look at the aftermath of this, and for me one of the interesting aspects of it is the response of the Germans. So on that very afternoon, and then on the next day, they had a good look at the battlefield, because the Anzacs had retreated by then, and the Germans looked at the battlefield and they saw what had happened, and it's clear that to some extent they were horrified at what had happened to their men. And a few days later, after the occupation had been completed, there were investigators who were flown to Crete, and their job was to investigate what had happened to German troops at places like 42nd Street, what had happened to the paratroops. And there was a very strong suspicion that there had been widespread maltreatment. There had been, for example, mutilations of bodies. And so the Germans investigated this in some detail. They were clearly very upset at the treatment of the paratroops from the very first day. And by the time many of the troops arrived, one thing that they noted was the stench that came from rotting bodies that had been lying around in the Cretan sun for some days. The investigations, in fact, showed that by and large, the defensive forces had not acted improperly. There were cases where what was observed was that they thought eyes had been gouged out, but the investigators put this down largely to birds of prey. They did conclude that there were cases where locals, Cretans, armed with whatever they could get their hands on, had attacked Germans and even mutilated them, but the finding was that that was in rare cases. In the case of 42nd Street, what they noticed was that when they first inspected the battlefield, there weren't many wounded Germans there. That was noted. It was noted that there were knife wounds to the heart, but without bleeding. And they took that, of course, as a sign that those wounds had been inflicted even after those men had been killed. And so there were these suspicions that were raised and, of course, were passed on to the Australian and New Zealand authorities, who took the view that yes, of course, this was a very vicious battle, but the use of bayonets is not banned in warfare. There was nothing in their view that was untoward in the way that the Australians and New Zealanders had fought at 42nd Street. So look, I think I'm close to out of time. Just as a bit of an afterword, I didn't want to give the sense that the only kind of killing in war is the killing that occurs in the heat of battle, and that the last chapter is called In Cold Blood. It's a sign, I think, of the anger of the Germans, the anger at what had happened unexpectedly to their elite troops, that they undertook acts of revenge, targeting local civilians who, in their view, had acted improperly. And in one awful event which foreshadowed many others later during the German occupation, they rounded up the men of a small village near the Malmö airfield. Their suspicion was that those villagers had maltreated German parachutists, and they killed them. And fortunately, there's very good evidence of that massacre at the village of Condamari, because one of the German photographers was there and kept a record and also reported on it after the war. As for 42nd Street, there is a memorial there. There has been for, I think, about 4 years now, and perhaps when we can all travel again, for those of you interested in touring battlefields, I can only recommend Crete generally. The memorial at 42nd Street is quite close to the Commonwealth War Cemetery at Suda Bay. I would recommend also visiting the German War Cemetery, which is positioned on that crucial hill overlooking the Malmö airfield in a very beautiful location. So to this day, 42nd Street is remembered in Crete. I found myself that it's certainly true that Cretans to this day remember very fondly the efforts of Australians and New Zealanders to defend their island, and have gone to the effort at 42nd Street of setting their gratitude in stone in this way. As for the bayonet, people still train with bayonets. There have been bayonet charges in the Falkland Islands, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan. So that old view that there is a place for the bayonet, especially in terms of psychological preparation for war, all the evidence is that still holds true. Look, I think that's enough from me. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Peter. That's fascinating, particularly the bayonets and the rather old-fashioned charges. Now we've got some questions for you in the chat, so I'll just open that up and read them out. Michael Buckridge is first. He was in early on, asking, are you able or willing to find fault with the Allied commander's plans or execution?
Yes, I think in terms of the defence of the island, the role of Freyberg has been quite a controversial one. Freyberg had very good intelligence. He had a lot of men at his disposal, and I think the main criticism of Freyberg is that he placed too much emphasis in preparing for a seaborne invasion. So he disposed troops in such a way as to intercept a seaborne invasion, where he would have been much better off focusing absolutely everything on the 3 airfields, because the German plan relied entirely on taking at least one of those airfields. In Freyberg's defence, part of the German plan was indeed to send a couple of light flotillas, but just light flotillas. That was very much secondary to the airborne invasion, and those flotillas were intercepted by the Royal Navy, so that there was no seaborne invasion. And so, yes, he should have focused more on the airfields. He didn't defend Malmö very well on its western flank. The airfields weren't in any case by that time being used by British aircraft, and so another suggestion is that he should have just destroyed the airfields and made it impossible for the Germans to land anywhere. And I think there's some merit in those sorts of arguments.
Thank you. Graham Miller asks or makes a statement. I think this is the last time the Germans used paratroops. Is that so?
Yeah, well, not entirely, but on a limited scale. And if anything, the initiative passed, especially to the Americans, who used them in latter stages of the war. And I think the Germans then belatedly acknowledged that perhaps they'd been premature in winding back their parachute program. I think Hitler's response after Crete was, well, now the surprise element's no longer available to us. And so they didn't support that branch of the armed forces as much as they might have. So it is very much a turning point from that point of view, that the way that the German paratroops were received did impact very heavily on German thinking about that kind of warfare.
We have a question from Marcus Fielding. With the destruction of the reinforcing German seaborne invasion, it would seem that the airborne forces fought very well against numerically superior odds. Why did the German High Command judge the future US air forces to be too risky? Was their success too costly?
Yeah, it was certainly costly. And the Germans, that's a good point about the numerical superiority of the defenders. And the German disadvantage also was that they had very little idea. Their intelligence was poor, and the Australians and New Zealanders had shown good discipline in remaining undercover. So the German reconnaissance efforts hadn't conveyed that intelligence. They really didn't know how many forces were there, how they were disposed, with the result that they got this awful fright when they arrived. And they found also the disadvantages of that kind of invasion. The Germans worked in such a way that the weapons were dropped separately from the men. So their weapons, that they had, most had a pistol and a knife, and a few had submachine guns, but most of the weaponry was dropped in separate canisters. So the Germans, when they were floating to the ground, were extremely vulnerable. And then when they got to the ground, their next task was to find a weapons canister. And of course, in those circumstances, the weapons that could be contained in the canisters were light weapons. And so they didn't have the artillery available to them that they had on the mainland in Greece. So the circumstances were much more favourable to the defenders in many ways. And for the Australians and New Zealanders, the irony of this was that while it was extremely high tech from a German perspective, it gave the Australians and New Zealanders the opportunity to engage in very close combat, because these parachutists were dropped in many cases among the enemy in a way that they hadn't experienced in earlier campaigns.
Okay, now I've got two questions that relate to each other, one from Marcus Fielding and one from Boyce. And you can answer them both together, I suggest. In defence of Freiburg, it would have been difficult to forecast the interception and destruction of the seaborne force. The seaborne force would be less lightly armed and would have posed a greater threat. And Boyce says, what is the extent of Freiburg's knowledge from Ultra regarding the detail of the invasion versus airborne and seaborne?
Yeah. So Ultra was certainly suggesting that there was a seaborne component. So he was aware of that, and that should be said in his defence, that these flotillas were light flotillas, and they played a subordinate backup role, so that their interception, or the interception of the first flotilla, the second one turned around after the first one was intercepted. That was in the night from the 21st to the 22nd, I think. So they had essentially a backup role, and these were light flotillas. So with that in mind, and there's an element here of benefit of hindsight, of course, but if you take in particular the Australian 2nd 7th and 2nd 8th, they were disposed at a place called Georgopoli, which is adjacent to a long stretch of beach, and they were completely wasted there. And when it became evident that the action was either at Retamo in one direction or Malomé in the other, it took them so long to get to where they were needed that by the time they got there, the Germans had already won that crucial advantage.
Marcus again, did Crete become an important access base for the rest of the war like Malta was for the Allies?
It was used for a while Rommel was still doing well in North Africa, but after El Alamein, Crete became strategically much less significant, and so didn't figure as prominently in Allied strategic thinking as had been the case earlier. So that was noticeable for those who remained in Crete, and the story of Crete after or during the German occupation is a really interesting one as well, because of course at first the temptation was to try to win back the island, and so the British tried to encourage a local resistance movement, and for a time there were lots of Australians, New Zealanders and others who were still on the island because they missed the evacuation vessels. And what the British did then was to infiltrate into Crete SOE officers, Special Operations Executive, with that idea of encouraging the local resistance. And you might know the story of the kidnapping of a German general. So that this resistance movement was quite active, and of course the locals were very keen to expel the Germans. The Cretans had in their history experienced long periods of occupation by many forces. So they had fought tenaciously to get rid of the Germans, and they suffered a very challenging occupation. And their disappointment was that they thought that the British weren't doing enough to help them liberate their island. But the point by then was that the British strategic focus was elsewhere. By that time, there wasn't much to be gained by reclaiming Crete, and they'd already decided that their strategic focus was elsewhere. There is, by the way, a very interesting case that the main, well, some of you might know the figure of Paddy Lee Firmer, who was centrally involved in this kidnapping of a German general. There's a film that was made about it with Dirk Bogarde called Ill Met by Moonlight, which might be worth watching. But the key SOE operative in Crete was an Australian, a man from Tasmania called Tom Dunbabin, an archaeologist, and he was the leading SOE figure, trying to organise the resistance, but also by the last couple of years trying to tone down the locals' efforts to eject the Germans, because he realised that this wasn't a point of strategic focus, and the more that they poked the bear, the more extreme was the German reaction to that.
Excellent. Well, I think we might call that to a close. Thank you very much, Peter. It's tremendous. I'm very interested in the getting the book, particularly the discussion of bayonet fighting. I don't see much of that. So we'll move on to other business. I'd like to just clap Peter, as I know you can't hear it, but it was an excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Pleasure. And I'll encourage everyone to get the book if they can. Just moving on, in the next couple of days, we will be sending out an email with a link to Peter's website, and there'll be another 3-minute feedback survey. Some of the questions you'll have answered before, but I need you to answer them again. Thank you for those who filled out the last survey, and I hope you do it again. We take notice. There's a new question there that will help us in future planning. For other MHHV business, our next speaker presentation will be by Dr. Mark Dappen about Australia's Vietnam, myth versus history. This is on Tuesday, the 8th of December at 7 p.m, another Zoom meeting. Mark Dappen is a much published and awarded author. In his book, Mark reveals at every stage of Australians' commitment to the Vietnam War has been misunderstood, misinterpreted, and shrouded in myth. From army claims that every national serviceman was a volunteer, and the levels of atrocities committed by Australian troops, to the belief that there were no welcome home parades until the late 1980s, and returned soldiers were met by angry protesters. So Australia's Vietnam is a major contribution to the understanding of Australia's experience in the war, and will change the way we think about the memory and military history. We also have a one-day conference planned for Saturday, March 20 next year at the Royal Historical Society rooms. We're still planning that, and of course, all the COVID regulations will have to be taken into account. It may move. The topic will be Bloody Beachheads, the battles of Gona, Buna, and Sanananda. This brings And this brings this evening's session to a close. Committee and I would wish you all good night on behalf of the MHHV, and thanks, Peter, and thank you all for joining us. Hope you come again. Good night.